Good morning, everybody. Today I'm just going to introduce the reading assignment that you have about the pros and cons of genetic engineering. And there's a good deal of controversy about genetically engineering organisms. There are some really good reasons to do it and some very big concerns. So let's start with some of the reasons why people would do it. We talked about in the notes a very silly reason, which was to make neons, fish glow in the dark. That may not be really a very pressing need. But there are reasons for doing genetic engineering. If you take a look at this slide, you can see here, this is regular rice, and this is genetically modified rice called golden rice. That rice was genetically modified to add a whole bunch of different kinds of amino acids that people need. There are places in the world that have struggled to grow foods other than rice, and rice is something they can grow. And their diet is missing a lot of the important nutrients. So scientists decided to genetically engineer rice to include a lot of the amino acids that are missing in someone's diet, golden rice. And that's a reason, a valid reason, to really consider genetic engineering. Another here is called the flavor saver tomato. The flavor saver tomato is something that can be picked long before it's eaten, and it holds up really well. Turns out it doesn't taste really good, so it didn't catch on, but that was a reason why somebody was interested in genetically engineering food so they could travel a long distance and last in a long time without rotting. A major problem, if we look up here, a major problem in agriculture is bugs eating food. As much as we like to grow our food, bugs like us growing their food for them, and they eat a lot of our crops, and that's a very big deal. So farmers historically have had to spray their crops with pesticides. Pesticides are nerve-damaging agents. They harm the brains of insects. Turns out they also harm the brains of people. And also expensive and time-consuming to apply. They can be applied by hand like this or by plane. So labor intensive, it's a really big problem. And so some plants have been genetically engineered to make their own, basically their own pesticides that kill bugs that aren't damaging to us neurologically, to our nervous system. And so these plants, not these, but the plants that have been genetically engineered can resist insects themselves, and so they don't have to be sprayed with pesticides. And so that stops a big chunk of the problem of dealing with bugs without added chemicals, and that's a really good reason. Down here we see climate change is causing droughts in some places, and this happens to be a rice that can grow in a place that has a drought. And so as we face more and more of the climate impacts, climate change, people are starting to look to genetic engineering for making plants that can survive these new climatic conditions. So there's a lot of reasons why people would consider genetic engineering. We have some specific examples where genetic engineering has been tried and not gone very successfully, and you'll read about this in the reading today. Here we have cows grazing on grass. That's what they eat, that's what they evolved to eat, that's what they do really well with. Unfortunately for farmers, cows grazing on grass means you need a lot of land, and it's very expensive to grow grass. It's also expensive to grow the grass and ship it to the cows, or to have the space for the cows to live. So farmers who are growing a lot of beef want a cheap way to feed the animals. It turns out this crop right here is really cheap. It's soybeans. Soybeans are extremely cheap, and they would love to grow the cows or feed them soybeans. But soybeans, unfortunately, are missing one really important amino acid that cows absolutely need, called methionine. When we were doing the codon chart, it was the amino acid MET, right? So that amino acid is missing in these soybeans to a large extent. And so cows would not thrive on soybeans, but it's cheap. So farmers would love it if they could feed them soybeans. So they genetically engineered, they took the gene from a nut, a Brazil nut, and put it into the soybean. And so the Brazil nut has this gene for methionine, and now the soybean has a lot of methionine, and they could feed it to the cows. So then you could feed really cheap feed to these cows and make them grow quickly, and they'd have enough methionine. Right? Unfortunately, there was an unexpected consequence. People who are allergic to Brazil nuts, not soybeans, people who are allergic to Brazil nuts, we know a lot of people have nut allergies. It turns out the gene they took from the Brazil nut that was for a protein that people are allergic to. So people who had nut allergies suddenly have soybean allergies. And what's worse is that when the soybean is placed into the feed and the cow gets the protein frequently, the meat can have the protein. And so somebody who has a nut allergy could go into the grocery store and buy a steak and turn out to have a horrible reaction. So that was actually pulled and not approved by the FDA. It was caught before it became publicly available, thank goodness, because otherwise people would have been dying from severe nut allergies after eating meat. Now, one way we could deal with that is have labeling on the meat packages, but as you'll see in the movie we see later in this week, the meat industry has opposed that kind of labeling, and so that's kind of a problem. This picture just shows that the folks with the soybean who have nut allergies are having reactions. So, and another major use for genetic engineering is something called Roundup Ready crops. Now, crops don't just have a problem with bugs. Bugs like to eat our food, and so we've made bug-resistant crops. But our crops also have a problem with other plants, with weeds. Weeds also grow in our farms, and we spend a lot of energy taking care of those weeds. Now, in the old days, people would pull them by hand. That's unsustainable. The numbers of plants that we grow, the crops that we grow for food for people across the world. And so we've started spraying herbicides. So not just pesticides being sprayed on the crops, but herbicides, that is plant killers too. Now, of course, you can't spray plant killers on your growing plants and just expect to kill the weeds, because you will also kill your corn or your soy or whatever it is you're growing. And so a company called Monsanto created a chemical, a weed killer, and at the same time genetically engineered plants that would not be killed by it. So they are growing, say, genetically engineered soybeans that now have the genes to resist Roundup, this herbicide. The weeds growing nearby don't have those genes, and so they can just spray those plants with Roundup, and it will only kill the weeds and not the plants. Of course, that means that our food now has Roundup on it. And it also means that farmers have to buy these seeds that are Roundup ready. And the problem with that is that poorer farmers might not necessarily be able to afford to compete anymore. There's some other problems that you'll read about in today's article. I'd like you to think, as you read about this, what your feelings are about whether we should continue genetic engineering, and if so, under what circumstances.